The Secret Story of Hin. Chapter 18. Emancipators. Never, we freed ourselves. The rage inside me didn't just burn. It roared, hotter than the sun's own fury, swallowing everything in its path. It scorched my veins, blistered my bones, turned my grief into gasoline. I wasn't angry. I was an inferno, a storm born from centuries of chains, scars, and silence. They thought they broke me, but all they did was wake something ancient, something sacred, something violent. Every whip crack became thunder in my chest. Every name they stripped from me carved a scream into my soul. And now, I don't bleed, I erupt. The night smelled of iron and damp earth, the kind of air that clung to your skin like a second shadow. I didn't just hunt them. I violated every piece they thought they owned. I moved not like a man, but like something summoned from the soil screens, born in the rot beneath plantation floors where teeth and chains still slept, through blood-drenched cotton fields, where every stalk whispered the names of the broken and the buried. I stalked, through swamps thick with mosquitoes, snake rot, and the stench of unmarked graves. I crept, I slit throats in silence, dragged men into the same bayous they used to drown our kin, burned them in the beds where they raped. I didn't bring justice. I brought retribution. I was the screen they smothered, returned in flesh. But it wasn't just rage. No, this was deeper, older. I felt it in my bones before I even knew the names of the stars or the taste of freedom. The ancestors came to me in the stillness, in the dark places between breath and death. They poured their grief into me like hot iron. They branded my soul with a mission. Free as many as you can before the fire takes you too. This wasn't survival. It was prophecy. A holy war written in scars and blood. I watched them hang my brother Sino like meat, and the silence that followed, it never left me. I knew I would die the same death or worse. But if I burned, I swore I'd burn their whole fucking world down with me. The war had already begun before the first shot rang out at Fort Sumter. It started because they hunted us, because they couldn't just let us go. So I stopped running and started hunting. I became the rustle in the cane fields before the blade falls, the stillness before the scream. Not a man, not anymore. Something worse, something their ancestors feared in the old country but thought they'd buried in chains. They told ghost stories to keep white children in line. Turns out, I was one of them. But my haunting didn't rattle chains. It broke them, didn't flicker lights. It lit plantations on fire, didn't whisper through halls. It roared through blood-soaked walls as I slit throats in silence and left bodies for the buzzards. I didn't hunt. I punished. I didn't rebel. I erased, not for justice, for vengeance, for Sino, for Mama Kalisa, for every child sold, every mother raped, every scream that died in cotton. They called me the swamp ape, the Bigfoot. Deceivers. Let them rot in the filth of their own false tongues. Fuck their lies. Every twisted scripture, every blood-soaked law, every promise dressed in chains. My name is Hin, son of my son Mama Kalisa, and that evil earth devil Master Samuel. I am the fire that lit the way for those who still dared to dream of something beyond the lash. The rebellion at the Jones plantation wasn't simply a beginning. It was an inevitable eruption centuries in the making, splitting the earth open beneath the weight of generations who had swallowed their screams. It wasn't mere strategy. It was sacred rage, long buried beneath calloused hands and bent backs, finally breaking loose as whips erupt, cracking towards their masters, and the sound of these same men learning what fear truly feels like. As we carved our bloody path through the South, plantations fell one by one, from Mississippi to Louisiana, Alabama to Georgia. But it wasn't just structures we brought down. It was the silenced men who once called themselves masters, the freed breath of those who had forgotten the taste of it, and the uneasy question echoing in every valley. What happens when the enslaved stop praying and start plotting, when they learn to strike like generals and haunt like prophets with blood on their tongues and fire in their eyes? What happens when the hunted become hunters, and every lash, every rape, Every stolen name becomes a weapon sharpened by memory. You don't get a rebellion, you get an awakening. This is why the word woke terrifies them, because it ain't just awareness. It's the moment the blindfold burns, is the day the slave stops kneeling and starts remembering. Because a people who are woke don't go back to sleep. They rise, they retaliate, they reclaim everything that was stolen. We left a testament to everything their history books would later sanitize and minimize. These devilish deceivers hide truth, bury fact, then flood the world with lies, drowning history in their filth and calling it gospel. For every chain shattered, every master buried, every child freed, sent a message that could no longer be ignored. By the time General Butler seized New Orleans in 1862 and labeled its enslaved population contraband of war, we had long been waging our own war, quiet, ruthless, and unseen. Union officers never realized that many of their most accurate reports on Confederate movements came from Arkemen scouts, once enslaved, now shadows in the swamps and forests, slipping through the land like whispers of vengeance. While politicians polished their speeches beneath chandeliers and marble ceilings, splitting hairs over the morality of bondage, we set the South on fire. The Arkemen raids didn't wait for Lincoln's signature. We made it necessary. Every plantation I razed, every supply line I shattered, every enslaved soul I freed, I trained, and I armed them. Together, we made it harder for the Union to pretend this war was anything but a fight for black liberation. They called us a plague, but they could call us whatever they pleased. We were the Free Jones people, the Arkemen. And may the plague we were become a pandemic they'd never again contain. The Emancipation Proclamation wasn't born in a cabinet meeting. It was dragged from the reluctant pen of a president by the blood we spilled and the fear we inspired. We weren't petitioning for freedom. We were taking it, torch by torch, body by body, soul by soul. We carved freedom into the flesh of history with blood-stained hands and unyielding resolve. The Ida Trail became our underground river of souls flowing south to Cameron. Unlike the mighty Tubman's northern routes, our path cut through the densest parts of the Atchafalaya Basin, where slave catchers would find themselves suddenly vanishing, their bodies feeding the alligators and water moccasins that became our unwitting allies. The ecosystem itself seemed to conspire with us, swallowing our enemies whole while guiding our people to freedom. Allendale Plantation stood as a monument to Henry Watkins Allen's particular brand of cruelty. The future Confederate governor's mansion gleamed white as bleached bones beneath the Louisiana sun, its architectural perfection masking the horrors it contained. Records from 1855 showed Allen had purchased 43 slaves from the infamous New Orleans trader Thomas Foster, 21 of them children under the age of 10, deliberately separated from their parents to break their spirits early. As his ledger coldly noted, our vengeance came not with torches and war cries, but through the ancient knowledge preserved, taught to us by the old Miss Mary. The poison, a mixture of ginsenweed nightshade and secretions from creatures that dwelled in the swamp's darkest corners, flowed silent as cemetery mist through their wells, their streams, their pristine water barrels. The formula similar to the Haitian Revolution, carried in the memories of those who'd fought alongside Toussaint Louverture, passed down through generations of women who kept our true history alive while masters forced their Bible stories upon us. The blueprint for what we built and what we burned wasn't born in America. The name Toussaint Louverture carried across the Atlantic like a sacred infection. Not in books, but in breath, not in weapons, but in wisdom. It was passed through the hands of midwives and root women, hidden in songs sung over cooking pots, sewn into hens pressed into the palms of children at dusk. While the masters fed us parables of meekness and mercy, we kept the real stories alive, the ones where the enslaved became generals, where black flesh did not bow but struck back. The Arkemen rose not just from suffering but from memory, ancestral, strategic, unstoppable. The overseers collapsed first, their bodies betraying them as viciously as they had betrayed humanity. Their skin erupted in blisters that wept black fluid, their balls turned to liquid fire. Their screams echoed across the fields they'd ruled with the lash. Historical accounts would later attribute the death at Allendale to a cholera outbreak, another lie to hide the truth of our resistance. You're Satan's seed, one dying house slave wailed, pointing at me with fingers already blackening with death. The accusation cut deep because it rang with partial truth. I was indeed Master Samuel's bastard, born from violence, my white father's blood running cold in my veins while my mother's spirit burned like demon fire in my soul. Confederates spoke of us in whispers as Butler's black demons, believing we operated under Union orders. The Union blamed Confederate brutality for driving slaves to such desperate measures. Neither side could accept the truth that we answered to no white authority, that our revolution ran parallel to theirs but served a different purpose altogether. Longwood Plantation fell differently. Governor William Henry Talmadge's pride, with its sugar fields that had produced 1.2 million pounds of refined sugar in 1861 alone, fueling the Confederacy's war effort. Historical records would later show that Talmadge had personally designed the punishment cages where rebellious slaves were left to slowly roast in the Louisiana sun, their skin blistering until they either submitted or died. Fire consumed at all sugar cane leaves soaked in coal oil, stacked around the sugar house where they'd boiled men alive for attempting escape. We locked them all inside, the faithful slaves, the overseers, the master's family. Their screams painted the night sky orange, reflecting off the Mississippi like a second sunset, a beacon visible for miles that announced our presence more effectively than any proclamation. The Talmadge fire coincided with Brigadier General Daniel Ruggles' retreat from Baton Rouge, forcing him to divert troops to hunt for insurgent Negroes rather than reinforce Confederate positions against advancing Union forces. Military historians now acknowledge that these diversions contributed significantly to Confederate losses in the lower Mississippi theater. By 1863, the Freeman of Jones settlement in Cameron had grown to over 1,600 souls, a number that terrified both Union and Confederate leadership. We all agreed to take the name Jones, not to honor that evil woman Mrs. Bessie, but because it was the only blood link we had left to each other. It wasn't about respect, it was about survival. That name didn't belong to her, we made it ours, because so many of us had been torn from our mothers, our fathers, our kin, sold off, separated, erased. So we did what our people always did, we found each other in the wreckage, and we rebuilt. Taking the same last name was how we stayed together, how we became a family when ours had been ripped apart. That was a tradition among the enslaved to use the names of the plantation or the people who owned us, not to remember them, but to remember each other. It was how we created community out of brokenness. June's wasn't her name anymore. It was ours. And we carried it like a scar that healed ugly but never let us forget where we came from or who we found along the way. Nothing was ever handed to us. We took everything we had. Every scrap, every breath, every inch of freedom was wrestled from the hands of those who swore we weren't meant to have it. We didn't inherit, we survived. The Arkemen and women would go on to forge entire bloodlines, establishing the Smiths, the Johnsons, the Jones, the Williams, the Browns, the Pointers, the Masons, the Garlands, the Terrells, and the Whitaker families, all born from the ashes of fallen plantations, brought down by our own hands. These names weren't given, they were claimed. Each one carried the weight of rebellion, the memory of fire, and the vow that we would never be broken again. Neither side wanted to acknowledge that enslaved people could carve out independence without white saviors or overseers. Mexican General Martel Juan Almonte, who had once served as a translator for the Comanche and understood oppression firsthand, granted us protection in exchange for helping defend Mexico's northern border against both American and French imperial ambitions. Standing in the ashes of Longwood, I watched our numbers swell beyond control. 300 more souls now looked to me, men with hatred burning in their eyes, women clutching children born in chains, but destined to die free, too many to move quickly, too many to hide from the slave patrols that grew more desperate as our legend spread. I chose 10 from our ranks to lead the larger group south, including Teach, a former house slave who had memorized every word in Master's library before burning it to ash. His knowledge of coastal navigation had saved dozens already. Pamela still bore fresh whip scars on her back, earned when she'd refused to reveal where escaping children had hidden at Allendale. Ernest could move through swamp water silent as death itself, having learned the art from Choctaw natives who occasionally traded with slaves when white eyes weren't watching. Take them south, I commanded my chosen 10. Follow the Ida Trail. Tell Ida and Pockwall what we've witnessed here, how Natchez planters now sleep with pistols beneath their pillows, how New Orleans merchants ship their goods with armed guards, how the mighty Confederacy trembles at whispers of our names. I kept 20 with me, the hardest, the hungriest, the most damaged souls. Midnight Red had watched overseers force his wife to bear 5 children by 5 different men, breeding slaves like cattle for the auction block. Raggedy Mouth Row had killed 3 slave catchers with a cane knife after they'd murdered his elderly father for sport. Eagle Eye Captoria could hit a man's heart at 100 yards, a skill learned secretly while cleaning her master's hunting rifles. We turned east toward Mississippi, where the infamous Nathan Bedford Forrest's brother had established a plantation worked by over 200 slaves. Confederate military records would later reveal that Forrest diverted cavalry units from Shiloh to protect his family's property, weakening his position against Grant, another small victory for the Arkemen that history books conveniently omit. As we approached the old Jones plantation, the place where our revolution began, it loomed through the morning mist like a nightmare refusing to fade. For years of blood and fire separated now from then, yet the stench of death still hung thick as Spanish moss in the air. I fell to my knees on the spot where Miss Bessie had forced Big George to whip me until my back split open like overripe fruit. The same earth where Lucky George had violated children while their mothers watched, helpless and chained. The same soil that had absorbed the blood of my friend Sino, executed for the crime of learning to read from discarded newspapers. It was Nat Turner who lit the fuse in Sino. After reading about the rebellion, he snapped, couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't keep pretending. He tried to lead an uprising with nothing but rage, a rusted blade, and a handful of prayers. They caught him before dawn, dragged him through the quarters, and hung him slow, left his body swinging for 3 weeks as a warning. But they misunderstood what a warning really is. Sino's rebellion failed, but he didn't. He was the first to say enough, the first to make them bleed. He was the spark, and sometimes a spark has to burn alone to show the rest of us how to light the damn fire. I began to sob. Why? I screamed at the sky, at their white god who'd witnessed centuries of atrocities without intervention. Why us? Why must we suffer? Why do you damn us? And why won't you answer me? My fists pounded the blood-soaked earth until they bled, each strike an accusation against heaven's silence. But heaven never answered. Their God remained as mute as he had when slave ships packed child cargo so tightly that people suffocated in their own waste during the Middle Passage. Instead, the wind shifted, carrying the sweet scent of burning sage, Mama Khaleesi's medicine, the rituals she'd maintained despite the overseer's lash, preserving connections to ancestors whose names had been stolen along with their freedom. They manifested like smoke on the wind, spirits of those who guided every step of our vengeance. Mama Khaleesi stood before me, not broken and blooded as she died, but radiant with power older than plantation Christianity, deeper than their shallow prayers. Behind her stretched generations, men and women who died in chains but whose spirits had never been bound. Warriors from Dahomey who'd fought slave catchers until overwhelming numbers brought them down. Healers who'd eased suffering with knowledge carried in memory across the Atlantic. Children whose potential had been cut short by white greed. Why ask their God for answers, my son? Mama Khaleesi's voice carried on the wind. Their God wears their face, speaks their tongue, blesses their whips. But we, she gestured to the host behind her, 100 strong, 1,000 strong, their eyes gleaming with ancestral fire. We have never abandoned you. Every plantation that falls is a temple raised in our honor, spoke a warrior whose scars marked him as Igbo. Every master who dies screaming is a sacrifice long overdue. The ancestors showed me visions of children in Cameron learning letters, and numbers without fear of former slaves standing tall under the Mexican sun, of communities building strength that would one day reclaim what had been stolen from us. You are not their devil seed, Mama Khaleesi said, her phantom touch cool against my tear-stained face. You are our vengeance made flesh, the reckoning they earned with every drop of blood they spilled. I rose from my knees, the earth yielding one final gift, a small bone smooth and yellowed, probably from some child who died under the lash. I tucked it into my shirt, next to my heart, not as a reminder of pain, but as a covenant. When Union and Confederate historians later argued about what drove the war to its bloody conclusion, none would mention the Arkemen. None would acknowledge how our campaign of strategic terror forced both sides to confront slavery's true horror. None would admit that the Emancipation Proclamation came not from Lincoln's conscience alone, but from the growing fear that what we had begun might spread uncontrollably. The ancestors weren't whispering anymore. They were screaming, through me, through us, through every black body that had ever been shackled, whipped, raped, sold, hung, hunted. Their blood sang in my ears like war drums, not for peace, not for mercy, but for a vengeance long overdue. This wasn't justice. This was the correction of a world built on stolen breath and broken bones. I didn't gather 20 warriors that night. I summoned 20 storms, 20 holy curses in human form. We didn't pray before we marched. We promised the dead we'd answer their agony. Promised the unborn they wouldn't inherit chains, and fuck their textbooks, fuck their polished speeches, and their monuments built on our backs. None of this will be remembered the way they want it to be. We made sure of that. We carved our truth in fire, in blood, in names they'll choke on when they try to erase us. I and him, and I don't walk alone. I walk with the ghost of every man they lynched, and every woman they silenced. I walk with every child they tried to beat into obedience. I don't kneel. I don't beg. I burn. And so do the dead. The ancestors did not whisper that night. They howled. Their voices rose like smoke from every grave they were thrown in, every tree they were hung from, every name they were stripped of. And I heard them all, in the rustle of pine needles, in the thunder behind my ribs, in the way my warriors looked at me with eyes full of rage and resurrection. 20 of us stood together, bound by blood that wasn't always shared, but was always spilled. We weren't born brothers. We chose to be, and that choice made us dangerous. This war wasn't in any textbook. It wouldn't be spoken of in polite rooms or passed down in polite tongues, but it would be remembered in scarred songs. They will lie, as they always have. Say Lincoln's pen broke the chains, not the black hands that burned plantations to the roots, not the Arkemen who carved liberation into southern soil. They'll never admit it was our blood, not their mercy, that forced history's hand. That before the Emancipation Proclamation ever inked a page, we'd already written our own in flame and flesh, in the silence of white families screaming as we raised their empires to ash. Let their monuments fall. Let their statues crumble like their scripture, because we were never saved, we saved ourselves. We weren't freed, we freed ourselves.